All right. All right. I'm here with Daniel Tutt. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on my podcast. Really happy to have you. And if you could just take a moment to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do, projects you're working on.
Thanks, Eric. I'm an author, a philosopher. I teach. I've been writing quite a lot lately. Starting in 2021, I started off with a book on psychoanalysis and the politics of the family. So I have a training in Marxist theory, continental philosophy, the psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan. I studied at American University. I also studied in Switzerland under a number of kind of prominent philosophers at a very interesting residency program called the European Graduate School. And then my second book was How to Read Like a Parasite on Friedrich Nietzsche, which was more for a popular press, meant to, which was a great exercise actually to sort of, it was still had a kind of academic vernacular or approach, but it was really meant to be a more accessible book. And then more recently, I've published a new book on left populism with a comrade of mine by the name of C. Derek Varn, which is looking at socialist politics. And right now I'm working on a book about Freudian Marxism, the intersection of Freud and Marx. So really, I think, my work can be understood philosophically as trying to look at the troika, what I call the troika of Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Karl Marx, as sort of the three indispensable thinkers of modern life, who each give us sort of rich resources to understand the conundrum of the human condition, society, power, etc. Right. So that's the sort of anchoring point of my work. As you know, I think you read my Nietzsche book.
Yeah,
I think I really approach philosophy also in a Socratic mode of, like, if you can't make philosophy about life and living well, and then what's it for? So, I always consider my Emancipations podcast public philosophy, right? And so I try to make ideas accessible to people from all ages and all backgrounds, etc. Yeah, I mean, those are the main things. I have socialist politics. I've been interested in trying to reinvestigate the Marxist tradition, not only as a kind of economic critique of capitalism, but really also as a living way of transforming capitalism itself.
Okay. Great, man. Or did you want to continue?
I think that's it. I could go on and on, but I'm not going to go on and on and on.
Right.
I've already given you a lot. Yeah.
That's great. No, I really like the onus on public philosophy, taking it down from abstraction. I think Ben Burgess, his Substack is Philosophy for the People, I believe, right?
Yeah, I like
and
that.
I like that too. Yeah.
I should probably come up with a better name. This is my, first and last name. I gotta come up with a better name for my Substack, but that's a good one.
It is a good one. It is.
It's very good. I've had the opportunity to teach at basically a community college level, mid-level. I've taught at private schools, like fancy schools. I've taught at the jail, and so I like that variety. I don't have a full-time post, but right. In time maybe I will.
Yeah.
I'm very much a kind of independent. I put a big premium on my independence of thought. I think that's important to me, as another thing I would say.
Okay. Great. Well, I appreciate you unpacking all of that. I really do. So today we're going to talk about Marxism. Okay. Just an introduction to Marxist thought. What is it? We're going to go over some of the Marxist intellectual tradition and just get a better understanding of what we mean when we say Marxism. Okay. So to open things up, Daniel, what exactly is Marxism? How can we best understand Marxist thought?
All right. Well, I think Marxism refers to the tendency developed by Marx and Engels alike. So Marx and Engels had an intellectual partnership. So when we say Marxism, or when you just use the appellation of just Marx, it's a bit misleading, because Marx never intended for his teachings to be reduced to himself alone. And moreover, Marx was also critical of his followers, just like any founder of any tradition. You could think of certain sayings of Jesus would align there, right?
Yeah.
Although it's a bad metaphor, it's a bad analogy, because Marxism is not a religion. In fact, one of the best ways to understand Marxism is actually to understand the debates about Christianity in about the 1820s and 1830s in early industrial capitalism. So early industrial capitalism after the French Revolution, early 1800s in Europe, we see the advancement of capitalism into an industrial productive mode of production, which begins a crisis in society over the laborer, over the working class, but also eventually colonialism, imperialism, expansion of capitalism outside of Europe into other regions. But initially, there is an acute crisis of the industrial worker. And actually, one great way to understand Marxism is to read the book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which was written in the early 1840s by Frederick Engels before he met Marx. And this is an ethnographic and anthropological study of basically the working class in England. It's extremely revealing as to the conditions that capitalism was putting onto the vast majority of society at that time. He depicts lives of really, for grown men, their wage labor condition is almost indistinguishable from an indentured servitude.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Their quality of life is severely diminished. The prospects of their social freedom was almost non-existent. So Marxism, when we say Marxism, we refer, I think we could be very specific to both an analysis of capitalist society, a logic, a science of capitalist society, right? One that understands that capitalist society adheres to certain laws, organized around value. And Marx has a whole theory of value under capitalism. Although the word capitalism is not a word that Marx uses very much, actually, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Even though Marx talks a lot about the totality of the capitalist system. This is a big theme of his work. So there's this kind of descriptive and analytic scientific approach to Marxism. And then there is, of course, the political, social revolutionary part of Marxism, right? Now, famously, Marx will say that he combines sort of both. First, British political economy, namely Adam Smith and Ricardo, with the French political tradition, the French Revolution, the Jacobins, the thought of Rousseau, for example. So these two traditions are combined in Marxist thought, and they are synthesized in Marxist thought. And in a certain sense, Marxist thought is trying to transcend the limitations from both of these, sort of both the political and the economic side. This is why Marx's Capital, his most important text, of course, is called A Critique of Political Economy.
Yeah, right.
Right. So what I want to stress here is two things. One, a total logic of capitalist society, and two, let's call it a method for political revolution in the tradition that came before him. What many people call the emancipatory tradition, the tradition interested in universal justice, the tradition interested in social freedom, the tradition interested in emancipation from all forms of servitude. Okay. So I think that's Marxism, right? And Marxism sees itself also, and I'll stop here, as a kind of the vanguard or the advisory adjunct to the socialist and workers movement, because communism emerges before Marx and Engels as a concept and as a movement, right? And so does socialism, right? Marx and Engels come about, beginning really with the Communist Manifesto in 1848 to declare a new direction and a new strategy for the socialist and workers movement. And that strategy goes all the way up to the turn of the 20th century and, of course, beyond, right? But Engels dies right at around the turn of the century, and upon his death, a very interesting thing happens, which of course is that the largest socialist party in Germany, the SPD, basically adopts Marx and Engels' methodology. So Marx and Engels become very mainstream.
Right. Okay. So you wouldn't say, there's a lot of crude caricatures of Marxism, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit more, but it's not just the government controls everything, right? It's more of a kind of a diagnostic critique of capitalism, because I talk to people all the time about this, and that's one of the first things they say is that Marx advanced this kind of normative blueprint of how society ought to look. But you would say it's a pretty crude caricature, right?
A very crude caricature. I mean,
Yeah.
we know that Marx wrote hardly anything about a blueprint for
Yeah.
how society should be. I think, the accusation you're talking about, the stereotypes that you're talking about, are derived in the wake of war and crisis on the periphery of the capitalist system, namely China and Russia, in which you had large scale social crises. You had huge base of social revolution affecting the peasantry, right? You had these societies that had not undergone a bourgeois revolution in a proper sense, as many of the European societies had. And so as a result, Marxism was used as a strategic weapon for revolution, right? For revolution. And subsequently, following those revolutions in Russia and China, of course, you face the problem of bureaucracy, you face the problem of civil war, and Marxism gets a false picture, a bad name in that context. But that's really not, you can't really place that at the sort of doorstep of Marx himself.
Right.
In fact, a lot of Marxist historians in the 60s and 70s, like the American historian Hal Draper, were commissioned to write big studies as to whether the concept of dictatorship and like totalitarianism is in fact embedded in Marx's thought, right? So Draper would write 4 volumes on Marx's thought on this precise question, and other Richard Hunt would write very, very magnificent works on this. And the basic conclusion from their studies, even though Marx will say at one point, the most important concept I have developed is not the logic of class struggle, it is actually the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He'll say that in his later life. And I think it would be healthy for us to sort of define what he meant by that.
Right.
Because it's actually it may surprise some of our listeners when we actually define what he meant by dictatorship of the proletariat. So, there's a lot of work that's been done to sort of demystify and clarify the historical record on a lot of these things, because so much of the way Americans have been fed their understanding of Marxism is through a very particular Cold War propaganda model.
Yeah.
When we were fighting the Soviets.
Absolutely. And even the US government put out this propaganda, they called it creeping socialism, like it was almost a disease that was going to take over and kill everyone.
Yeah, totally. It's weird because Marx is a thinker rooted in the Enlightenment, rooted in the kind of rationalist philosophical tradition of Hegel. He's always talking about the necessity for building a society based on freedom. It's a very Hegelian idea. And to see him associated with the opposite of everything that is very paradoxical, So there's a lot to unpack here. And I think there's, you also have the cultural Marxism conspiracy that the right wing likes to talk about.
Yeah. I love how you said that before. And I heard you say, I think you said this verbatim, it's this paranoid vision that Marxism is invading liberal institutions.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because that's another thing, is what is Marx's relationship to liberalism, right? It's a critical relationship to liberalism, but it's one in which I would say it's trying to hold liberalism more honest to its stated and purported goals. right? Democratically speaking, because that's the other thing, is that once we introduce Marx's distinction of bourgeois society and the relationship that the bourgeoisie has to capital, we begin to see that a lot of the values of, free speech, democracy, et cetera, that are the sort of foundation of our society, truly cannot be fully realized in capitalism. So the critique of Marx, you can see why the right. I was just interviewing somebody on my show who's argued that slavery, stretching all the way up to the abolition of chattel slavery in the United States, was fully compliant and copacetic to capital and capitalism as a logic. And when you realize that capitalism is able to absorb oppressive systems like slavery, you sort of realize that the source of the problem lies there, and it doesn't lie in the individual in a certain way. So I think that Marx kind of terrorizes the right wing and liberal mindset because he's able to diagnose what they refuse to diagnose, because they see, and this is one of the main hallmarks of the ideology of liberalism as well as the general middle class, is that they see capitalism as a natural system.
Right.
And right. Marx's Capital, his whole critique of political economy, is meant to reveal the way that it's actually very much manufactured and follows very specific external laws.
Right. It's produced historically.
But it also alienates all classes. It alienates all classes in different ways.
Right.
And I don't want to get into a situation, because there's some Marxists who will conclude that, oh yeah, everyone is sort of equally alienated, when Marx actually will say, that the upper classes, they can benefit or get a kind of subversive gain from their alienation in capitalism, whereas the worker and the working class is not capable of extracting that. So capitalism is a system that sort of limits human freedom, and Marx sort of he points all of this out.
Okay, good. So you kind of touched on this a little bit. If you want to expand a little bit more, we can move on. But what was Marx mainly reacting against during his time? What was his reaction all about?
All right. So Marx was reacting first and foremost to a series of economists within classical political economy. Again, most notably Adam Smith and Ricardo, who had developed core theses that Marx will elaborate on, such as the labor theory of value, such as the relationship between labor and labor power, the idea that competition leads towards a type of equalization of profit rates, the idea that the division of labor produces efficiency, the idea that within the laws of capital, it becomes a question as to whether consumption or capital accumulation produces profit. Moreover, it becomes a question as to where value in capital actually comes from. Rent, profit, and wages was sort of the answer of Adam Smith, that this is the source of value. And Marx will, of course, disagree with this and land upon the notion of labor as the sort of locus of value. But then he will develop a series of distinctions about value, all hinged upon this notion of socially necessary labor time. So he adds this concept of time into his idea of the source of value creation in capital. And he is able to show that embedded in the system, legally, the whole system of law in capitalism creates a dynamic in which the extraction of surplus value necessarily exploits the laboring classes, the working classes. And this necessary structural exploitation, a whole system must be constructed to ensure its stability and its function and its exchange and its distribution. And then there is, of course, the notion of social reproduction that Marx introduces, which is that the condition of the laborer also, well, the boss, the capitalist class, must be responsible for ensuring not only their wage, but also the time that they're not on the clock, the time that they're not on the job. Right. Your wage, your salary also goes to ensure that you will be well rested and well entertained and happy enough to perform well at your job. So Marx is capable of sort of revealing the total logic of the capitalist class and its logic of impersonal domination. This is an important concept, which is a bit difficult to pinpoint. And this is where you get a lot of Marxists that are sort of saying, well, in reality, what Marx is really concluding here is not an analysis that's humanistically centered because of the impersonal focus on it, but what Marx is able to show through his notion and distinction between use value and exchange value is that the number one thing for Marx is that what he will call the proletariat, which is the class which is forced to sell its labor power as a commodity for survival. Okay, that's the proletariat. He will basically be able to show that this condition basically reduces the laborer to a condition not only of alienation, right? Not only of fragmentation to their own productive labor, the object of their labor, not only between man and, their fellow worker, but also to nature, right? So this condition he diagnoses of what capital forces the working class into is where his notion of total impersonal domination becomes very, very intense. And when you read Marx, this is where people get radicalized. Because you see, Eric, if you really think about that, you begin to see that, wait a second, he's given us a way to isolate and explain why every day my social existence has to be guaranteed by this abstract commitment that I make, which the system, the culture, the legal apparatus, the schools, etc., all tell us that it's natural. They all tell us that this relationship is compulsory. They all tell us that we're sort of free to engage in it, right? But Marx actually is able to reveal the dependence that is actually embedded in there, which actually has foreclosed our freedom. And this is the side of Marx's political economy. So that's what he's really responding to there.
Right.
Now, as I mentioned before, there's the French political tradition, because, the last great revolution before Marx is born is, of course, the French Revolution. And this revolution, of course, after its Napoleonic restoration, expands all the way to Russia. And as it goes outside of France, other societies go through their own form of bourgeois revolution, where the values of the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie here is basically traditionally defined as the merchant class, but they then become the kind of main arbiters, the primary rising or dominant class of the new liberal society after the French Revolution. Okay. And so their values of meritocracy, their values of individualism, their values of private property, competition, are all elevated as the primary values. And Marx enters in a post-Napoleon, he enters as a young thinker in a post-Napoleonic context. There's a problem, though, which is that the ideals of liberalism that brought all of this about in France, basically abolished to a certain extent, not completely, what we call the ancien regime, right? The kind of feudal, ancien aristocratic regime, right? And yet those values of the aristocracy still persist. So
Hmm.
when Marx's first article is actually an article against the censorship imposed by the king, right? Because you still had that to some
Hmm.
extent. So the French Revolution is sort of not fully achieved. You could kind of think about it as partially achieved, right? You still had constitutional monarchies in Europe at the time, but the Jacobins and Rousseau give Marx the impetus of thinking about history as a logic of class struggles, of one class over the other vying for power, but also engaged in a dialectic, which is often subterranean and not exactly visible,
Hmm.
that shapes the social field itself. And so Marx and Engels, they invent a way to understand the history of societies called historical materialism.
Hmm.
And this is actually one of the first books or texts that they write together. It's called The German Ideology. And it's done in like the early 1840s, before 1848. Okay. And its mantra is that um, the logic of all hitherto existing societies adheres to the logic of class struggle.
Class struggle. Yeah.
So class struggle is the way that we understand social reality. And the
Hmm.
task is to sort of, again, this is kind of the explanatory and analytic side of Marxism.
Right.
The task is to analyze social life accordingly, right? So I would say that's what Marx is responding to. You could also say he's responding to philosophy. He's a part of a movement called the Young Hegelians, and one of his mentors is a philosopher by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach.
Hmm.
Feuerbach referred to himself as a materialist philosopher. He was highly influenced by David Strauss's Life of Jesus. And so their relationship to religion is super interesting, because after Strauss and Feuerbach, their argument is that basically Christianity and all religions are fundamentally man-made.
Yeah. Projections of human projections in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, what Marx will say about religion, of course, is that it becomes a sort of ideological warm blanket to conceal the oppression that capitalism brings about. And, a lot's been written about Marx and religion. Marx, of course, was an atheist. He's born Jewish, but converts to Christianity. And Marx and Engels both have a complicated relationship to religion. I know we can talk about that, but
Mhm.
he's also responding to those dynamics, it must be said.
Certainly.
I think those are the main things. I think he's also responding to concrete political events. After 1848, which was the largest worker rebellion in the 19th century, right? And Marx and Engels were sort of the figureheads of that movement, the intellectual figureheads. Basically, there was a restoration and the workers lost. Okay.
Hmm.
By about 1850, Marx and Engels go into retreat. They stop being political until 1871 with the Paris Commune.
Yeah.
Okay. And then they become reactivated, and Marx writes The Civil War in France, and the political situation becomes more live wire. So they're also responding to the proletarian movement itself, and they have very specific prescriptions for it.
Okay. Great. That was awesome. If you don't mind, real quick before we move on, could you talk a little bit about how what Marx said about child labor and these dangerous working conditions? Because I feel like a lot of the time, and I was actually watching a clip by Jordan Peterson the other day that came up on my feed, and he was describing Marx in this kind of crude psychological reductionist way, that he's just resentful, he just hated the rich. But he writes that these conditions, I think he says this verbatim, are morally horrifying. So could you kind of illuminate that ethical side of Marx in this respect?
Sure. Yeah. there's a whole portion of Marx's Capital which continues the project that I mentioned earlier of Frederick Engels, the condition of the working class in England, which is trying to basically give what we would today call an ethnographic sketch of life as a worker and the conditions that workers are facing, kind of journalistic in a way. It's capturing both the data of economic flows from the capitalist class, as well as this sort of condition of the workday itself and the discipline that the boss imposes upon the worker at the level of the workday. Now, at this time, you still, by the time of 1848, Germany had abolished slavery, but they were still struggling with universal male suffrage. You did not even have the fight for the 8-hour workday. So, child labor laws were not yet developed. Those would be developed out of very, very robust and concrete struggle from below over many decades. By the time of the 1870s, you'll have a figure like Bismarck come into power, who will basically recognize in a very strategic way that if we don't solve what's called the social question, which was the crisis that's born from the proletarian and working class condition, then we will just have more social crises on our hands, right? And in fact, there's a lot of research done about how imperialism and colonialism was used as a way to satiate the terrible conditions of the working class and basically to send them off to fight in the colonies in a certain way. So if you take a thinker like Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche wrote a lot about the condition of the worker as well. And both Marx and Nietzsche have a very interesting point of almost like 180 when it comes to this condition, because Nietzsche says the servitude of any civilization requires, a class that would willingly come into servitude. For him, the question is, how do you keep that class kind of pacified?
Right.
For Marx, the question is, how do they become agents? And this is interesting. This is what makes Marxism still relevant, because you see a lot of socialism during the time of Marx and Engels was highly elitist. It was just, intellectuals basically saying a moralistic claim about the suffering of this class. Something must be done.
Right.
Okay? Marx realized very early on, even before 1848, he and Engels were part of a group called the Communist League, and it was kind of like upper class intellectuals pandering down to workers. And if you read the Communist Manifesto, they have a whole chapter called the True Socialists, who are basically kind of like rich guy socialists, detached from the condition of the worker. So Marx and Engels' whole practice is born from the idea that the working class are responsible for their own emancipation. That's the first line of the first International Working Man's Association. Yeah, right? That this emancipation has to be self-initiated.
Right. And that kind of reminds me of,
it cannot come on high. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, exactly. That reminds me of Hal Draper's socialism from below. This kind of, this bottom up, not up, downward.
Yeah, this is the distinctive feature of Marxism, and it kind of goes against what Peterson's saying. It also goes against this accusation of the Stalinist thing, right? It shows that the Stalinism was really an aberration to Marx's teachings. Marx is a very egalitarian oriented approach to the liberation there. And so is he appalled by child labor? Of course, but does he internalize that through a lens of personal resentment? I don't think so.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that. And I mean, that's a whole topic of like the right basically argues that anybody, because Marx actually does come from a kind of like a bourgeois family. Yeah. Marx is not really a worker. And you notice, like you see this even today with like Zoran Mamdani, where it's like, well, the right says, people from wealth are not allowed to advocate for socialism because it's a contradiction.
Yeah.
But did you notice that they never, what do they say if you are like a working class person, you're advocating for socialism?
Well, it's, yeah.
They don't really have anything to say about
Right.
that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
That's
Marx's point of view would be like, yes, exactly. The most powerful way to advocate for socialism is to do it from workers, a worker-centered plan.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of Gramsci's organic intellectuals. We'll get to that in a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, so this kind of leads into the third question here. How is Marx's thought different from the regimes of the 20th century? If you want to expand on that at all a little bit more.
Sure.
But this is very important too. To what extent should he be held responsible?
Okay. Well, as I mentioned before, he once said that the dictatorship of the proletariat is his most important concept. So why did he say that, and what does this mean? He says it later in his life. Actually, you know who he says it to is a Civil War, American Civil War general by the name of Wedemeyer in a letter, because this guy was a follower of Marx. He was what we call a 48er, right? So when the revolution of 1848 happened, a lot of the intelligentsia in Europe fled to America, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of German Americans, you know, even to this day, they can trace their family from that huge influx of people. And Wedemeyer was one of them. And he was like, well, what's your most important concept? And Marx says dictatorship of the proletariat. What he means by that, it's actually an old Roman concept. Dictatorship is an old Roman concept, which refers to emergency rule, right? So if you think about it, the way that revolutions used to happen is that you would basically have an armed standoff that would resemble a kind of civil war, which would lead to a commune.
Mm-hmm.
And this commune became the cell, the germinal basis by which a new governing power would be created. So if you take 1871 in Paris, that's exactly what happened. The workers rebelled over a course of a few weeks. They had a standoff with the authorities, and they created a commune in which they attempted to assume leadership of the society. So the dictatorship of the proletariat is very interesting because it is premised on the idea that the normal status quo of capitalism is actually the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, which means that, you know how I said before that exploitation of the worker requires a scientific analysis to see its exploitation, because you're told that it's natural,
common sense.
You're told that it's kind of common sense, the way of things, right? So the dictatorship of the proletariat refers to the idea that the only way to truly transform that oppression is by preparing the working class to assume a new leadership over society. Now, you have to understand that for a society to be on the cusp of revolution, the institutions of that society will experience and be undergoing profound decadence, which means that they're very brittle, very fragile, actually, and they've lost their legitimacy. I mean, like today, the fact we have Donald Trump in power, that may not signal that we're on the cusp of revolution, but it definitely signals that there's something very brittle about our institutions, and that our ruling class has lost legitimacy from the people. That's just square one. A revolutionary situation is like that times 10. Okay. And Marx and Engels faced those revolutionary situations all across Europe, in Poland, in Ireland, you know, in France, in Germany, right? Now, what they wanted to do was to take the fragility of the society and allow for the proletariat to be at the phalanx, at the vanguard of determining the new social order, so that capital would not be capable of reinstating itself in this methodology that I outlined before, based on impersonal domination and exploitation. Because again, this is a scientific necessity of the capitalist system. There's no, that is its general tendency. You can have periods of capitalism which will have welfare statism and reformism, but the general arc, the kind of the telos of capital, is towards that system.
Okay.
So that would be what I would say, is that now all of that got misunderstood in the 20th century. As you see, Marx never thought that revolution would happen on the peripheries. This is what's called in Lenin the weakest link. So Lenin said that actually I'm going to reverse Marx's thesis. Revolution of capitalism is not going to come from the core. In his time, it would be London. It's going to happen on the periphery of the world system in places like Russia. And he was right. He was right. And Marxism was used by the Bolsheviks and by the Chinese Communist Party as a method for revolutionizing those societies. They successfully transformed the peasantry, to their credit. They introduced literacy on an unprecedented scale. They accelerated the rights of women on an unprecedented scale. But they also created a civil war, internal civil war, which led to many deaths. Okay, so there's bright spots and there's dark spots, like all revolutions, right?
Just like everything else.
So, the idea is, if you look at a society like China today, they've adopted market reforms, but they still have a Chinese Communist Party committed to these various values. They've undergone the Cultural Revolution, which means that, their bourgeoisie was in fact subordinated over the course of many decades into a condition of proletarianization. See, this is another big debate about revolution, which is, what do we do with the dominating and exploiting classes? Right. What do we do with them? In Stalin's solution, in some cases, was quasi-liquidationist, which of course Marx had never advocated that, so you can't hold him responsible for that. And moreover, many Marxists within Stalin's regime fought against this. You have Trotskyism fought against this. You have many different strains of Marxism that fought against this. You have the New Left. Even you mentioned Draper, socialism from below. Marxism after, I think Stalinism really changes a lot.
Certainly.
The right wing loves nothing more than just to sort of, abuse that complicated history.
Certainly. And it is an abuse. And I always remind people, too, that ideas do have consequences. But you have to remember that historical actors transform ideas. They reinterpret ideas, right? You can't just describe direct causation to, one person. That wouldn't be very prudent.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay, so touched on this a little bit, but if you were to just throw out a couple, what are the biggest misconceptions people have about Marx?
Sure.
Biggest ones.
One, Marx is critical of utopian solutions. So he has a long polemic with utopian socialists. Two, Marx, which means that communism is not to be understood as this sort of pie in the sky sort of fantasy land where nobody has to do anything and it's unproductive labor, and it's this kind of middle class anxiety, right, that like everyone's going to be subservient to the state and thought control or some kind of Orwellian state. I would argue that the thrust of Marxist thought and philosophy is so opposed to that vision. Moreover, Marx actually had a certain admiration for the dynamism of capitalism and wanted, and this becomes kind of like a subsequent debate around what we call accelerationism, right? Which is, the question becomes, how do we adequately socialize the means of production? Not nationalize, but socialize the means of production, right? So that the capitalist class is no longer the main kind of minority, sort of small exclusive class, which determines the fate of the vast majority of people, right? How do you create a society in which decision-making power over one's labor time is decided more democratically.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, with that said, I think it's important to note that Marx is not in favor of a society that would be based on the dispensation of freedom, equality, and justice vis-a-vis distribution, right? Marx actually is more interested in freedom through self-determination in relation to production,
Mhm.
which is interesting if you think about it, because what that indicates to me is that Marx is very critical of the state. In fact, Marx writes very little on the state. In fact, Marx argues that the ideal way that a communist revolution would take place is that the state would ultimately wither, and it wouldn't be necessary as a sort of totalitarian centrifugal control mechanism,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Marx wanted a kind of you could argue, and some have argued, a communist republican society of independent producers, right? In which class suppression and this impersonal domination born from capital are ended, right?
Right.
In that sense, Marx invites us to think a new society that's more radically free than anything we could ever think of, in a way. And a lot of libertarians have even come at Marx and been very challenged by Marx for that onus on
Mhm.
freedom that he places there. It's huge.
Mhm.
Another misnomer of Marx, I would say, Eric, is the idea that every worker is class conscious by
That's
virtue
interesting.
of their exploitation. In fact, this is not true. And
Yeah.
Marx did not argue that. So the idea of how we inculcate the reality of this impersonal domination, which again, as I mentioned, is ideologically most of the time internalized as natural,
Mhm.
is a big part of education. You know, Marx famously had a debate with another communist who was a worker communist by the name of Willem Weitling. It was a very early debate, and I thought it very interesting. And Weitling said, every worker will know when we make the call for revolution, they will follow us because they feel it in their bones.
Mhm.
They feel that exploitation.
Mhm.
And you know what Marx said? He said, no, that's not necessarily true. We need institutions in civil society that will help workers learn the social question and the necessity for revolution.
Yeah. Right.
This is a
Yeah.
pedagogical point that I think is
Mhm.
very sound on Marx's part, because
Mhm.
the worker intellectual he was talking to, Weitling, was also kind of a conspiratorial thinker.
Mm.
Because you got to keep in mind, a lot of the left-wing activists at the time were for conspiracy, right?
Mm. Okay. Yeah.
Marx was actually vehemently opposed to conspiracy. He's an Enlightenment philosopher, right? He's got a different kind of epistemology at work here. So all I'm trying to say is that Marx understood our time, and our time is a time where class consciousness is extremely low, I
Certainly.
would argue,
Yeah.
and we should be sober about that,
Mhm.
right? It's
Mhm.
not as if every worker is ready to join a union. It's not as if, but I mean, that would be, I mean, Marxism sees itself, of course, as critical to the labor union movement. We can get into the reasons why. So the idea of where we're at the level of like social awareness of the principles of Marxism, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And I think that Marx was aware of that. I could probably list a few more. I think those
Sure.
are good. The final thing I would say is just that, you know, a lot of people also think that Marxism only talked about economics.
Yeah. That's kind of vulgar Marxism.
Right.
I
Or
think.
that he's a class reductionist. But in
Mhm.
reality, you know, Marx is trained as a lawyer. He's written books on literature, on romantic literature. You know, he's always referencing Shakespeare.
Mm.
He's able to basically give us an intellectual system that can touch the sort of social totality. So the interdisciplinary aspect of Marxism, which is no surprise that even in academia today, across every discipline in the humanities, you will find a Marxist orientation to it.
Yeah.
Right? Because his system is able to be absorbed in that way. So there's nothing economically reductive in Marx.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of the misconceptions too, when people misconstrue Marx, they're not. A lot of people haven't really read Marx deeply or really, engaged with the socialist tradition. It's more about whatever this kind of cultural grammar that we've inherited. And
There's that.
yeah,
There's also debates on the left
yeah,
that have pitted Marxists in the post-war new left, where people are interested in anti-racial struggles, are interested in feminist struggles, they're interested in colonial and post-colonial struggles. One of the things that I've tried to put forward in my work is that Marxism can be copacetic to all of those movements, right? In fact, all of those movements actually, should not see Marxism as some great antithesis or some kind of like vulgar other.
Mhm.
But a lot of insights can be learned from Marxism, in fact.
Certainly. Okay, so what was Marx's theory of alienation and exploitation, and how is that relevant today?
Yeah. Well, it's a very powerful theory that stretches into the core kind of question of humanism, in a way, of Marx. Now, famously, Marx will write these notebooks in 1844 called the Philosophic and Economic Manuscripts, and he will articulate kind of 4 areas of how capitalism as a system alienates. First, capitalism alienates us from nature, right? In essence, what this means is that instead of consciously mediating our relationships with nature, we confront nature through the imperatives of capital itself. And so capital's imperatives basically erode the collective. So like we see this like even with like AI data centers today, we see this all over the place with like environmental degradation, where we're not really permitted to intervene. I mean, we can try to intervene, and sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't succeed. But what we often don't acknowledge is that capital's imperatives are guiding the way for the transformation of nature. It's not in the measure of the collective good of humanity. That's number one. We're also alienated from our own productive labor, in the sense that we don't really recognize ourselves in our productive labor, because it's forced either into the division between mental and manual labor. It's therefore excluded from our own autonomy or social mediation over that labor. Our labor also rarely permits us to actually fully express itself in a creative way, right? I think this is this is hard, because in a way it's one of those conditions that we're not. I mean, we can kind of go to the bar after an 8-hour workday and complain about it to our buddies, right? But the avenues we have available politically to actually transform this are very limited.
Very limited.
Very
That's
limited.
a great point.
I mean, do you know how many workers right now are in a union in America? Only 11%. Some say 9%. Just a union. Just a union. And even if you're in a union, that doesn't mean that it's like some great panacea. They're going to give you all this.
Yeah,
right. So that's number two. Then he has this concept in the early Marx of what he calls species being. This refers to a theory of human nature, ultimately, in which the capitalist system kind of performs a separation between man's productive capacities and our relationship to our species being, which would sort of be like the ideal type of our collective imagination. You could think about it like if you I don't know, if you think about like Thomas More's Utopia, right? Thomas More's Utopia, I think, posited a work scenario in which everyone was responsible for working 4 hours a day, right? And the rest of the time was basically pure leisure of your choosing, which could also be engaged in productive hobbies or other activities.
Mhm.
And even,
Mhm.
John Maynard Keynes had the idea that the workday would be reduced, I think, to something like 4 or 5 hours a day.
Wow.
Keynes, even
Yeah.
Keynes, right?
Right.
By our time, right?
Hmm.
Now, if anything, we're seeing the opposite of that. We're seeing people having to work 2 jobs. I know a guy who works 3 jobs, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And so all of that alienates us from our common humanity, species being. And then the final point that he makes is that really capitalism alienates us from other human beings, in the sense that
Mhm.
today we have this weird dynamic, and I wrote about this in my first book, is that as capitalism kind of becomes more unequal, one of the weird things that happens is that we don't really get to know people outside of our own class. So we have
Mm.
the rise of assertive marriage. People really get married in their own class, and they stay in their own class, and they don't have the same social mobility that liberalism promises.
It's a great point.
So,
Yeah.
this is another 4th level. So alienation is basically, and also an alienation of our intelligence, of our imagination, of our capacity for cooperation, of the direction of where science could go, of the direction of where technology could go. Alienations is huge. I mean,
Yeah.
it may be Marx's most important concept, because it
Yeah.
basically refers to the way that capital erodes our capacities.
Mhm.
And when you really start to sit down and think about it, it makes you understand why revolution of this condition is necessary, I would argue.
Absolutely. And, when you start to see capitalism as this systematic logic that really shapes our entire perception of the world, that's super important. A lot of people are not thinking about capitalism that way. They're just thinking immediately of markets. They're not seeing it as a systematic logic. They're not seeing it as ideology.
Right. Exactly. I think that's valid. And I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about apropos
Mhm.
ideology, how we might introduce the concept. There's a lot of different ways that you've probably read about ideology.
Mhm.
I've been trying to kind of propose a return to a more classical definition of ideology, which I feel has kind of been missing in like postmodern thought.
Mhm.
Even though I was trained in postmodern thought, I've kind of abandoned a lot of it.
Could you just real quick unpack that classical understanding of ideology that you're
Yeah, I
thinking
mean,
of?
yeah, sure. I mean, the basic idea I'm trying to drive at is that so much of our ideology is actually determined by our relationship within the division of labor.
Mm.
And so I'll give you an example. Like,
Mhm.
you can deduce people's political choices with a good degree of certainty based on their proximity, if they are an elite manager, let's say, to where surplus value is extracted within their job site. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that Marx's theory of ideology gives us a way to understand that ideology is about the maintenance of the status quo.
Yeah.
And so ideologies become derivative kind of instruments or tools to maintain the status quo.
Mhm.
And so right-wing thought becomes interesting, because one of the best ways I think to critique right-wing thought would be to say, actually, we have a decadent society that needs a social transformation.
Mhm.
We need to introduce a fundamentally new way of relating to labor. We need to introduce new universal principles of the common good. We need to introduce a completely new way of relating to one another as human beings. But the entirety of all of that you talk about is for keeping things as they are.
Yeah.
And
Right.
moreover,
Mhm.
you have a model of deference to the existing elites. You want us basically to be subservient to like the Elon Musk. I mean, the whole ideology of Musk is like that. And
Yes.
it's even more pernicious lately, because lately he's been funding, race wars in Europe
Mhm. Mhm.
through his
I did read about
charitable
that.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy. So you see, ideology is about interest. it's about maintaining or not maintaining the existing way of things. I think, therefore, I would differ from some of these kind of more like, Slavoj Žižek is a very interesting philosopher, but he
Yeah.
has the idea that kind of ideology is driven by these sort of consumer apparatuses of enjoyment that kind of formulate our desire, control our desire. And I think to some extent, some of that's valid and some of that's true. But I think that a Marxist theory of ideology would get more precise in the context, right, of actual labor struggle and exploitation, and be able to show where people fall ideologically in relationship to those issues, right?
Okay.
But another thing with ideology that I'll say, and I'll stop here, is that we need a social movement and political movement to make ideology more apparent.
Yeah, to be able to recognize it. Yeah.
Bernie Sanders said one of his mentors is Eugene Debs, who, was the leader of the Socialist Party of America.
Mm-hmm.
Socialist Party of America got totally kneecapped in World War I because Debs protested World War I. And that was actually very noble. I don't know if you knew that, but the whole thing got liquidated by the government after that.
Okay.
But before that, Debs said there's three dominant parties: Republicans, Democrats, and the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party stood for the interests of the working class. The Democrats stood for the interests of the middle class, and the Republicans basically for the capitalist class. So much today would be clarified if we were able to say that about our party, but we don't have that party that really represents us.
Right.
So things get a little unclear.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know if like the liberal progressive approach is actually going to produce the transformation that we need. Most likely it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Most likely it'll be a kind of palliative or maybe like a Band-Aid,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would say is ideology needs to get more down to earth and be more practical.
Right. Okay. Now, real quick, this just came to my mind. How much of a difference would you say exists between the Democratic and Republican Party? I mean, they're basically two of the same in terms of this kind of bourgeois cohesion. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, they're two different relations to the capitalist class, which have a lot of overlap with one another, but also have different patronage and clientele relationships to the capitalist class. What we could say, I would say, what unites them, right, is the necessity for collusion and cooperation with maintaining the existing division of labor, but also the existing sort of basic class system.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a good example. After 2008, even though the Bush Republican regime kind of was responsible, at least initially, for the first part of the crash, the Obama administration, through the Federal Reserve, decided to introduce what's called quantitative easing, right? Which was basically to take the assets of the upper middle class, asset owning class, and not allow them to basically undergo a true transformation, which is what the system necessitated. They kept that class totally intact. And that's, I think, a good example of the way that both Republicans and Democrats work for a very particular set of class interests. One of the things I think's been confusing, though, is like Occupy Wall Street, which had the mantra of 1% versus 99%.
Yeah.
I think things are a little more complex than that. In fact, if we take Marx's notion of class struggle, and this is not easy to think, because I don't want to, this is what the right wing wants you to think, that Marxism is about stoking hatred of rich people.
Right.
It's not exactly the case. It's more strategic. It's more about like, what's good for all.
Yeah. It ignores the deeper critique.
It really would be more like, 15 to 20%, if we want to like be crude in terms of numbers, an upper echelon of 15 to 20% of the class that is represented by the two dominant parties. And then downstream from that, the working classes and below, because there's also sub working classes, of course, as
Mm.
well, still reliant on things like welfare or immigrant labor, etc., inner cities, etc. They're given kind of culture war frameworks to reroute the stakes of politics into something other than kind of these political economic status quo issues. So I think a socialist party would have to analyze things like that to show the unity between Republicans and Democrats.
Mhm.
Then you get things like, in Marxism, you have this theory called Bonapartism. And
Yeah.
this is a super cool theory. It basically means that sometimes capitalism will go into a crisis both material, but also in terms of its own values, in which the two dominant parties will not be able to alleviate the crisis. So the system summons forth a third option from outside the two parties. And
That's
that's
what
what's
we see
called
with Trump, in a sense.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what's called the Bonapartist.
Yeah.
And the Bonapartist comes in to basically pacify and reintroduce the status quo.
Mhm.
And this is very interesting because, in a way, that's kind of what Trump is. And I think the Democrats have a bit of an opportunistic agenda to portray his project as a little bit. They make it hyperbolic, when in reality, at the level of policy, of course, he's pretty much indistinguishable from Mitch McConnell.
Mm.
Maybe a little bit more aggressive
Yeah.
in terms of cutting taxes and so on. But so that's what I would say is, there's a lot of continuity between the two classes. And I think that, people today use this concept of like the Epstein class.
Yeah.
And I reject that. I don't think it's really useful. It kind of goes back to this notion about conspiracy. We should keep our analysis a little bit more focused on the bottom line here, in terms of who's benefiting. Now, of course, liberal progressives will argue that, well, we can expand that base of the middle class. We can kind of, allow more people into private property. I mean, the New Deal of FDR. The New Deal of FDR was the single largest expansion of private property in human history. Okay. And it, really created what we call the ownership society. But in our age, liberalism as we know it has become way more fundamentally right wing, and so much of the social has been privatized that Marx's predictions, and especially like in his late work, are really becoming more true. And this, I would say, the future is more Marxist than it is like liberal progressive, because the system has allowed capital to take over so much that, in my opinion, it's increasingly impossible to think about progressive reforms.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
It's very difficult to do that. I mean, that's why, Eric, it seems that only socialists can advocate for progressive reforms, like Mamdani.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Like Mamdani is basically more FDR than he is Eugene Debs.
That's a good point. I would agree with that.
Right. But know what's interesting is that a lot of people don't realize that Mamdani won by calling himself a socialist. He didn't win by calling himself a liberal progressive.
True.
But I think what that means is that people are hungry for something new. They're hungry for something new. And that's why Mamdani should stick to his values. He should not compromise on his values, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's it. I agree. I would agree with that. Okay. Let's see. Oh, yeah. I do want to talk about this a little bit more, Daniel. What was Marx's view of human nature?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, first and foremost, Marx rejects the idea that there is a static or substantial theory of the human. You could call Marx's theory of human nature relational and materialist. But by materialist, I don't mean like, pre-Aristotelian Greek atomism as much as I mean social materialism, which means that his understanding of the human is basically founded in the kind of ensemble of social relations. This is his phrase from the Theses on Feuerbach. And therefore, the human in capitalist society is facing a condition, a problem, which is basically that they're prohibited from immersion into this ideal of what I referred to before as the species being of humanity, this kind of abstract immersion into the unity of collective life. So in that sense, Marx does have a theory of human nature, but it's a theory of human nature in which human nature is subordinated to imperatives that are out of its control. Okay. And it's a theory of human nature that is also importantly based on need. So one of Marx's main points, is that liberal political thought, but also liberal economists don't value the constitutive basis of how need fits into our core capacities, right? And there's been a lot written about this. And I think that, one of the debates in the 20th century after the Second World War, where we honestly should recognize that capitalism reaches what many call its golden age with the Fordist welfare state, where basically you have the biggest expansion of the middle class in human history. Okay. A lot of Marxists during that time totally abandoned the foundation of human need, because what they saw was basically that consumerism had satiated the baseline of human needs to such an extent that it created, and if you read like the Frankfurt School, like Marcuse and Adorno, they're big on this. Well, and for them, revolution is no longer a thing for the working class, because basically consumerism had pacified the working class. They no longer needed to interrogate this social question. But what I'm seeing now, and I think after the crash of 2008, and like the way I interact with Zoomers and young people and even my own children and just people you see in society, is that I think we're moving back to a crisis that's at the level of subsistence and need, in the sense that more and more people are basically deprived of a truly healthy society, of a society that's based on like a social contract. We have developed a highly antisocial situation with this whole cybernetic, the dominance of the internet, the dominance of social media, all of this stuff. So I think it's important that we move back to some of Marx's core insights in that regard. I would say it's interesting because at the same time, let me say this and I'll close here, socialists argued for a long time that we demand a humanistic, human-centered society, kind of like I'm articulating right now. But one interesting thing happens is that elements of the ruling class had a tendency to recuperate those demands, those humanistic demands, and liberalize them and remove their anti-capitalist thrust. So an interesting debate happens in Marxism, especially in the 20th century, of what we call anti-humanist Marxism, which is not to be understood as like nihilistic or like, we reject the human or we reject value. It's not like that.
Right.
It's rather to say that bourgeois ideology will co-opt Marxism if it presents its demands with a kind of humanist thrust, if that makes sense. And this is a big thing that I study at my channel, Emancipations. Louis Althusser, the French Marxist, is big on this. So humanism has a very complex kind of background in Marxism. There's probably more to be said, but I'd leave it at that. Yeah,
certainly. And one more follow-up question: do you think Marx or the Marxist intellectual tradition in general, finds anything of merit in the more constrained vision of reality? That human beings are fundamentally selfish, they're competitive, they're not cooperative, and maybe if you introduce, Christianity into the discussion, that they're sinful. human beings are inherently sinful. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, in a way, you have a very interesting debate in the history of Christianity, um, which was called the heresy of Pelagius, and he was a figure who emerges who denies original sin.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great Marxist thinker who's Polish by the name of Leszek Kołakowski, and you know what he says? He says, "Look, you want to talk about Marx's relation to human nature and Christianity, you got to start with the Pelagian heresy, because Marxism is a Pelagian heresy of the 19th century, in the sense that actually what Marxism is trying to put forward is an optimistic worldview that says man actually is not in the Hobbesian condition that you just articulated."
Yeah.
Right? So that's very important. And that optimism is a defining feature of the Marxist tradition, and that's what makes it a warm. I mean, there's one philosopher, Ernst Bloch, who calls Marxism a warm stream tradition. It has a warm stream embrace of this kind of Promethean idea that humanity can seize the means of production for the collective good of all. Right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's not too much pessimism in Marx. Marx has I would say, it's not a pessimistic philosophy, but nor is it naively optimistic, because it's a dialectic between the two, is what I would say. It's not reducible just to an either or. But it's a tough question.
It is a tough question.
And it's interesting.
I've written about this before myself.
Yeah.
That if we really do, as Christians believe, come from this infinitely loving creator, this perfectly good, all-powerful creator, you would think that there's just so much unrealized potential within us to be actualized.
Right.
And this deeply pessimistic philosophy, this original sin, just doesn't really seem to comport with that image of God.
Right.
And that kind of suppresses a lot of revolutionary consciousness, I would say too. That, well, we're just sinful, we just have to repent. Our suffering is divinely ordained by God. There's a better world to come.
Yeah.
And I think that stifles a lot.
No, I think you're right. I think Marxism calls for Marxism is associated with the tradition in philosophy you could call as realism. So it's also interested in social reality. This is sort of where Hegel comes about, where it's, the task of the social question of realizing because the social question is interesting in a way, because it's kind of like the hypothesis is that if we organize politics around the working class, and they're capable of realizing the crisis, which they know in their bones, but can only articulate when they're in common good and collective relation to one another, then we will have changed the way that the class sees social reality.
Yeah.
So the Marxist political project is to shape how people see social reality in a certain way. Not in any cultish or mind control way, but in a way that's in line with rational Enlightenment principles.
Yeah, and a way that's emancipatory, liberating as well, I would say.
Right, people have nothing to fear from Marxism. I mean, Marxism wants abundance and freedom, and it does not want a kind of idiosyncratic despair or pessimism or suffering to be put back onto rich people or something like that, I mean, there's been many rich people that have understood the truths of Marxism and of course participated in the movement, most notably Marx led the 1848 revolution with an aristocrat. So it takes people from all classes to participate in this.
I should just note too, when I read Marx and engage with these Marxist thinkers, I've never seen it as anything else than emancipatory and expanding democracy, and, liberating people. I've
Of
never really
course.
seen it as anything else.
Yeah, exactly. Because
Yeah.
I do think there's some strains of liberal thought that tend to valorize the status quo to such an extent that they even miss relations of exploitation and oppression because they've sort of glossed over it,
Hmm.
um that actually is interesting because there's this great French philosopher Jacques Rancière, and he says politics starts at the moment at which two conflicting parties clash over the definition of what constitutes a social wrong.
Oh, that's interesting.
Interesting,
Yeah.
right? I always like that
Yeah,
definition.
yeah, that's great. Okay, so this kind of leads into the next question. So how should Christians think about Marx? Just think about socialism. How do you think they should think about this?
Well, I think they should think about Marx through a social and historical method, which would actually make an invitation to go back and think about their tradition in a way that's a little bit more imminent and not so transcendent. Meaning
Mm,
that if you look at the history of Christianity from a Marxist lens, and there's been many people that have done this, including Engels himself. He wrote a book. It's a short book, but it's a good one, called The Peasant War in Germany.
mm,
And that's an interesting book about Protestant Reformation, where Engels basically says, look, uh, there were three ideological positions at the time of the Protestant Reformation. There was the reformist liberal, Martin Luther. There was the revolutionary mystic, Thomas Müntzer.
mm,
And then there was for the status quo, which was the princes and the aristocracy. Okay. And he then kind of makes an interesting point, which is that Müntzer was kind of the Marxist figure. And Müntzer was the guy who, of course, inspired by the book of Revelations, inspired by the book of Daniel's dreams, he led a peasant army against the princes and the aristocracy. And that is where we get the idea of the Rainbow Coalition, by the way, because when he fought when he had this battle, okay, a rainbow appeared in the sky,
mm.
and he saw this as divine inspiration to lead the charge. They were suppressed, but it became this inspirational point for future emancipatory movements. And so there's a way that even in Jesus himself, that you can read as a prophet of the class struggle of his time, right? A class
Certainly.
struggle that was really more primitive than the class struggle, much less complex than Marx's time, of course.
Hmm. Hmm.
Really more like a master-slave society in a way.
Yeah.
And so all of that's beneficial, I would say, that's number one. I think number two, Marx should help Christians stay a little bit more grounded in social reality insofar as, what is religion good for? Marx may have had a bit of a reductive answer, which is
Yeah.
that, well, it's really a palliative to social suffering. That may
Hmm.
be a reflection of the very extreme industrial era suffering that he's encountering.
That he's encountering. Yeah.
Our
Yeah.
suffering's different today.
Hmm.
I would say our suffering's more loneliness, it's more social isolation, it's different form of alienation, it's more abstract,
Certainly.
right?
Hmm.
um but it's still a form of suffering. But you
Hmm.
see, the fact that Marx associated Christianity as successful in alleviating that suffering but insufficient in transforming it, that should be something that challenges Christians. Because I think that there's a misnomer to say that Christianity cannot touch politics. We get this from St. Augustine. It's
Hmm.
deep in our tradition. Like, render unto Caesar what's
Yeah.
due Caesar, that whole idea.
Hmm.
So I would argue that there's a way in which we can honor the revolutionary kernel here and not allow that to compromise our congregation or compromise our commitment. Because if you were to say that, you've then, in a weird way, politicized your relationship to God, because you've basically said, well, if I'm revolutionary, well, I can no longer be a faithful Christian, which is not true.
Mm-hmm.
And moreover, Marx never, and very few Marxist regimes will force atheism. I mean, even Stalin, eventually, in the Muslim Stan region, I only know because I traveled there, brought back Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, I think the Bolsheviks made an error, because when they invaded those lands, they basically said, look, Islam is aristocracy. We're going to free you from it. Okay.
Right.
But then they brought back the madrasas. They allowed people to practice religion again. So it's a complicated history, but I think that moving forward, we need a Marxism that will be understanding of religion, and we need a
Mm-hmm.
religion that will see revolutionary commitments not as antithetical.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
That's what I would say, and I think that's doable.
Certainly.
I hope.
Yeah, and I wanted to add too that, if you really read the Old Testament, you really dive into the biblical literature, a lot of scholars would say that these early Christians were communists in a sense. Private, any kind of talk of self-ownership or private property would just seem totally antithetical to Christ, his more radical, egalitarian kind of communal posture toward the poor, toward those around you. So I think this kind of bourgeois Christianity is just deeply antithetical to what Christ actually preached. And
well, also going back to the stuff I said about the agency of the worker, and how Marx had all of these debates with other socialists, who may have been very Christian in their way of looking at the poor, the least of these shall inherit the earth, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, Marx kind of wants to go farther than that and say, well, actually, your condition can be transformed here and now.
Yeah. Right.
So this notion of the materialist and imminent realization of the kingdom, right? There's a lot of Marxists that have said, well, that's what Marx is talking about. He's actually talking about an imminent theory of the coming kingdom, not some transcendent,
that it can be actualized here, the kingdom of God,
right? And this introduces us to the pantheist debate, and Spinoza and all of these debates, which are interesting because those debates had a very particular relationship to church authority at a time when the church authority was super authoritarian, right? So, pantheism, right? This idea that God is in nature was a huge heresy, right? That basically would get you banished from society and lose your job. And obviously that wouldn't happen today.
Yeah.
Right. But I do think that capitalism has changed what it means to believe in God. I mean, I think Walter Benjamin argued that, Nietzsche didn't go far enough. He really thinks that, and he makes a causal argument, the capital kills God. Okay.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche never said that, right? So he goes very far.
It reminds me of, just real quick, that reminds me of Eugene MacArthur's book. Have you ever read The Enchantments of Mammon?
I have not. No.
Yeah, he talks about some of this too, that capitalism has disenchanted nature. Our union with nature, in a sense. I just wanted to add that in there.
No, that's great. It's very interesting. I've heard of this. I need to read his work.
I think the book's upstairs. It's a really big book.
Yeah.
I haven't finished it, but
no, that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. I gotta check that. I've heard the title.
It's
things.
Yeah, he's a great thinker. Did you want to continue at all before we can move on?
No, I mean, I could give some book recommendations. I mean, I would say Atheism and Christianity by Ernst Bloch is a good book recommendation. It's a very good book recommendation on Marxism and religion would be Occidental Eschatology. Very cool book about how Middle Age movements, from like the Franciscans to the Valdesians to the Joachim of Fiore to Munzer himself, should be read as precursors to Marxism and socialism during the
Okay.
Middle Ages. I really benefited from his book there quite a lot. There's been a lot written on Saint Paul and Marxism because many philosophers like Alain Badiou and Giorgio Agamben have basically said that the type of universalism that Marxism is linking up with was initiated by Saint Paul
Mm,
initially,
interesting.
right? This idea that you could forge a community that would break from all of your filial pre-established identities and subsume into the universalism of a brotherhood that's like realized as a Holy Spirit. Christ may have like talked about these things abstractly or whatever, but Paul obviously codifies it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they say, but Jew basically argues, yeah, this is what Marx is also talking about in a certain way. So I found that's another one, you know,
I'll have
Saint
to
Paul in
check that
the
out.
the Saint Paul by
Yeah.
Badiou. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have a few more here. So, Daniel, if Marx were alive today, what do you think he would say about AI, social media? What would his approach be to these things?
I think that Marx would see in AI largely a crisis over labor, not as an autonomous technological force that is somehow fundamentally eroding the capital labor relation. That core antithesis, that core antinomy between capital and labor functions for Marx as the kind of local or the sort of locus of the class struggle from which bourgeois and proletariat emanate, by the way. So
Mm.
Marx ultimately has kind of like a two-class theory because the main contradiction of capitalist society is between labor and capital. I think that the AI thing, I've written about this a little bit. I'm not a total expert on it, but I would say that it represents what Marx referred to as commodity fetishism in a very
Mhm.
hyper expression, meaning that what AI is basically able to do is proliferate and enter into fields of human expression and capture human attention, art, journalism, literature, you name it, in what Marx called exchange value, which is basically a full commodification, whereby in AI, you are basically able to experience a technology that's totally devoid of any use value, of any like purposive, organic, human centered value. It seems to me that when we use AI, we are using a form of value that's fully determined by capital's imperatives. And therefore, it's perhaps one of the most alienating things that we can do. That's not to say that it's not useful. It may be useful in some sense, but in the long run, what I think it's actually producing, what it's actually leading to, is a diminishment for a society in which free labor would be capable of determining and creating. I mean, its biggest setback is in the field of human creativity itself. Its
Mhm.
biggest
Yeah.
setback is in the creativity and
Right.
imagination. It is fundamentally transforming that. It's fundamentally transforming our attentional apparatus as well. So
Mhm.
it feels to me as potentially catastrophic in a way. Of course, in one-off scenarios, it could very well make some white collar mental laboring occupations, it could make their life easier.
Mhm.
It could make that in some blue collar. I mean, if we think, architecture, for example,
Right.
if we think about like law and the legal apparatus, it could actually help there. But where it's going to really pose problems is in the fields of arts and in our field, in the fields
Yeah.
that
Right.
we care about. And so its whole premise is upside down. It's an upside down world because capital is a kind of anti-humanist force in its own way. We talk about the species being from which
Right.
capital does not emanate. What that means is that we will see, and we see this now, AI starting from the point of the highest use value, poetry, fine art. Well, of course, they're going to be giving us this AI version of this instead of even creating a society in which that would be prohibited to commodify, right? We don't have the power to stop it. I mean, we need to develop mechanisms to halt its spread, to control its spread, I think. Otherwise, I think that its biggest problem will be the deterioration in the long term of new generations. It will severely diminish their capacities.
Certainly.
Their
Yeah.
capacities, full spectrum,
Mhm.
full spectrum. So I think that Marx would say that. I think in social media, Marx has a lot of interesting things to say about, and many subsequent Marxists, about labor time and the way that you could actually turn the time that we spend on social media into remunerated time, right? In other words, like there was this thing in the 70s called wages for housework, which became in Italy like a demand on behalf of socialist feminists.
Mhm.
You could think of a socialist society in which your time on social media was paid for based on a different end. But because capital is our end, we're participating in a system which owns us and which does not serve us.
Does not serve us. Yeah.
If you could
Yeah. Good
reconfigure
point.
that, and if you could reconfigure that towards a collective output, towards a collective good, but we don't have the political imagination to do that. I think one of the things that Marx says is that human society only moves and transforms on the basis of of goals we set for ourselves, right? He has a very sober concept of historical necessity. Nothing will exceed that. There's no kind of magic of sort of chaos, his focus is that humans set the limits of what they tell themselves they can achieve and seal their own fate in a certain way. So right now we don't have organizations that can truly contest AI, and that's tragic. But we need to create, I think, some resistance here as a priority.
Great. That was a great analysis. Okay, so we talked about bourgeois ideology a bit throughout this discussion, but what I really want to talk about is what are organic intellectuals? What did Gramsci mean by developing organic intellectuals?
Okay. Yeah, the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci develops this concept of the organic intellectual to basically refer to the way that every worker has the potential to engage in the intellectual enterprise. And moreover, most of the time we define the task of an intellectual, we're defining it on the terms of private interests defined through a very designated division of labor according to the status quo. And therefore, the idea of the intellectual is sort of the reserve of usually some kind of elite. And it's a status symbol, which is determined ultimately by the capitalist class. The organic intellectual is determined by the subordinated classes. And Gramsci would also say the working class,
Yeah.
but we could also expand beyond that. So the organic intellectual refers to a kind of subterranean figure who emerges that becomes a kind of voice of the condition of a particular class that's facing subordination.
Okay. It's able to articulate their interests, their experiences,
Yes,
developing
exactly.
like this kind of counter logic.
You could say it like this. You could say that most definitions of the intellectual we have are subordinated to a logic of bourgeois individualism and atomization.
Yeah,
Okay?
definitely.
The organic intellectual, and I'm not saying that the organic intellectual is common today. I wish maybe that there were more organic intellectuals. But organic intellectual will have tacitly or intentionally broken with the kind of norms of the individualist form of thinking, the intellectual. They will be interested in how to further liberation, how to further emancipation. That's not to say that the organic intellectual is like an autodidact, not trained by institutions. It's rather to say that the organic intellectual can be sort of defined. You'll know one when you see one. You'll know one when you see one. They're not subordinated to the same protocols of private elite institutions. Now, why this mattered for Gramsci is because he basically argued that the working class movement must cultivate this type of intellectual in order to build class consciousness within the subordinated classes. And because it's open in theory, in principle, to all workers. The prerequisite to be an organic intellectual, of course, is to have the desire to be an intellectual.
Yeah.
And I would say that, not everyone has that, and nor should we expect everyone to. But what Gramsci's getting at is that it's necessary for the socialist movement to cultivate this cadre, right? He's getting some of the ideas from Lenin. Lenin has the idea, of course, of the vanguard, and that the intellectual has a very particular role to play in organizing what Marx calls the advanced sections of the working class. So in Gramsci and Lenin's view, the organic intellectual needs to be focused at that nexus, at bringing out and representing in society. It's not as if the organic intellectual is meant to be some quietistic figure. It just means that their commitment, their responsibility is to the subordinated classes. And they organize their whole life, all of their projects to serve that class. That's kind of an organic intellectual. And Gramsci lived it. Of course, he wrote in prison when he was imprisoned by Mussolini and the fascists.
Yeah.
Right. And he teaches us a lot, and a lot of Marxist intellectuals are very inspiring because the majority of them are really not university intellectuals. They lead much more interesting lives than that. I found a lot of just in their biographies, just in who they are, right? So that's what I would say. They're trying to pierce kind of dominant ideology and to present a new way that social reality can be made known to the subordinated classes, right? So they're, their ethics and their honesty matter a lot. If you're really talking about an organic intellectual, those kinds of things will matter a lot. Ideally, right? I think Martin Luther King could be an example, in a certain way. It's not only Marxism or only Marxists per se. It's kind of like an intellectual who has a social task,
right,
that they have absorbed and they have committed to.
Would you say there are contemporary organic intellectuals today?
I think so. I think that many, there are many, in fact. I think that we are seeing emerge. Okay, well, this actually introduces an interesting question, because if you study, like I recently interact with this very interesting working class scholar out of the UK called Lisa McKinsey, and she's argued that within the working class in England, the UK, etc., there's a lot of organic intellectuals, but she argues that if you actually look at the numbers of how many book deals they get, how much representation they get, it's actually quite low.
Okay.
And I was actually studying this in the United States through the work of Jennifer Silva, who is a wonderful ethnographer of the working class. And you find something similar. So I think that there's a kind of, that it's there, that the desire is there, but a lot of the opportunities are missing. And this introduces an interesting question, which is, how do you persist with this commitment, even if you are struggling to work with the established publishing groups or universities, etc.? And that seems to be a common predicament. So the answer would be, historically, that you would align with the Socialist Party. Well, there are a few there are opportunities for that we could point to and that people should engage with. So I would say, for a young intellectual that may be listening to our conversation, say there's a lot of setbacks, but there's also a lot of openings. And just be
Mm.
very careful about your institutions matter. How you are shaped and habituated in them will determine a lot of how you think. Okay. So you just need to balance your commitments and you need to choose your solidarities
Yeah,
carefully. I think
it's well
that's what I
said.
would say. And I think
Right.
that um, even if you get trained by elite institutions, you can still have a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and the working class, and you should.
Hmm.
I'm not
Yeah.
advocating like don't go to Harvard or something.
Right.
I'm not saying that. I'm
Yeah.
just saying that be cognizant of how elite institutions will recuperate and co-opt your radicalism. Be aware of that. Be aware of
Okay.
that. What do you think, though? Do you think that there's organic intellectuals today?
I would say that there are. I would largely agree with your analysis of organic intellectuals, though. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. I mean,
there is a yearning and a desire. One of the things I've wanted to do, Eric, is really help organic. I want to
yeah.
empower and get more resources to them.
Hmm. Hmm.
That would be good. That would be ideal.
Certainly. Yeah. So I'll ask one more question in terms of Gramsci, and then we can close out with
Okay.
these other two. How would you define common sense in terms of
Mm,
how
mm.
Gramsci talks about it, and why is it so powerful? Common sense ideas.
Well, in part because of the fact that from the experience of the exploited classes, there emerges an ethics that is both decent, that has a propensity to kindness, and also a propensity to seriousness. And common sense matters so long as you're analyzing common sense along class society and the differentiation that class brings about, which is hard to do. It takes patience and courage, because it's very taboo to think that way.
Yeah.
Because most of the time people want to say, well, your common sense is based on your generation, you're a millennial, or your common sense is based on the fact you're from New Jersey, or your common sense is based on the fact you're from Oregon, or you're this, you're that. I think Gramsci would say, that capitalist society has a class tier system and that those differences actually elicit meaningful distinctions. So the task would be to know and get to know the common sense in Marxist sense of the broader working class. And I think, I don't agree with everything he says, but Orwell has this idea that socialism should be about the cultivation of common decency.
Mm.
And I find that very interesting, because there's an argument that the relationship that the working class has to wage labor produces a spontaneous form of common decency. Then you think about something like Trumpism, which is so anathema to common decency. So it makes such a mockery of common decency and even of common sense. There's nothing
Yeah.
common about this.
Right.
And what I think that is a reflection of is the fact that the working class in the last few decades has undergone such profound fragmentation that it's kind of lost its foothold in common decency and common sense.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's tragic. And so I think what it means is that actually one of the things socialists need to start doing is rebuilding civil society so that common decency and common sense can actually be reanimated.
Reanimated. Yeah.
We've kind of lost it, if
Mhm.
we're honest. And it's not our fault, these technological changes, the deindustrialization, the loss of healthcare, has
brought back a certain social crisis.
Mhm.
So common sense is tricky in those conditions. It's still there. It's, I think the way that we could think about it is kind of like it's downstream to ideology, right? In the sense that
Yeah.
it's the element that ideology has not polluted or corrupted,
Mm.
that can be made universal and that can be known, but also it's the valve by which you're able to communicate, like with Trump supporters. Like even my own family, I've had to do this because many of them, not all of them, but many of them do support Donald
Do
Trump.
support Trump. I remember you telling me that. Yeah.
So, you know, like,
Mhm.
well, common sense, I try to throw my lifeline to points of common sense, you know, instead of ideology, right? So I think for political organizing, common sense is extremely valuable as a rallying point for building solidarity with people.
Mhm.
At the same time, you know, Marx has the view that embedded in the common sense of every worker, this is a very interesting idea, I want your thoughts on this, is a knowledge of the exploitation that, as I tried to articulate earlier, Marx says is total.
Mm.
Meaning that even if ideologically a worker will justify that as like the natural par for the course, that doesn't negate the fact that embedded in that ideological acceptance is a common sense of the bad part of it, of the pernicious part of it.
Right.
So I think
Mm.
strategically you would want to identify with that
Mm-hmm.
and break from the ideology, but sometimes it's hard to do that because people have, you know, so much ideological stuff built into it. It's kind of like
Well,
plaque on the teeth.
that's what I was going to say too. And someone like Gramsci would probably say that ideology is all that much more powerful when it's not recognized as ideology. It's
Oh,
it's, it's
yes,
just it,
exactly.
right. It's seen as, like we've been talking about, this kind of common sense.
Yes, but his insistence is that common sense, in a true materialist way, is the kernel of something that socialists should trust. We should always tend to trust common sense, so long as we can locate it, right? This kind of goes back to the question of optimism,
Mm.
right? And also never losing sight of the fact that, you see, this very interesting book was written called Libidinal Economy by Francois Lyotard. And he calls it an evil argument. And I think it's very evil, where he said, if you look at the 19th century workers movement, the workers really enjoyed their exploitation. Right. Now, I think this is very flawed.
Yeah.
Very flawed. And, you know, if you thought that about them, then how could you ever trust their common sense? No, but actually we have a different theory of the human than that. So it kind of comes down to philosophy.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And trust. And we should trust workers, you know, to give an account of their lives and of their condition. And that embedded in that condition is a desire for something different. That's what I would say.
Okay. All right. Let me see what else I have here. Really well said. All right. So, what aspects of Marxist philosophy remain indispensable? And if someone wanted to read Marx seriously, where should they begin?
Okay. I think after everything we've gone through, what remains most indispensable is the idea that capitalism can be known as a total logic and system, that meaning that we're not dealing with a fragmented system that is driven by the idiosyncrasies of affects and moods and personalities. We're driven by a system that has laws and imperatives, and therefore it's a scientific account of society. Okay. Why Marxism remains indispensable is because it's the best method for transforming this bad system into something more free, more equal, and more liberated. Right? So Marxism can diagnose the total system and it can transform it. Okay? And that's why I would say it's indispensable, amongst the many other reasons that we've talked about. Also because, to read Marx and to take it seriously gives you a way to understand history and society, a lens of sense making that links you to a field of righteousness. And I don't mean that in a moralistic way, but I mean that based on my own experience and what I've gone through in my life, that I've always felt deep down that I need a way to address the suffering and injustice I've seen in the world.
Right.
And I've tried a bunch of different things. And I just feel as if Marxism has given me the best way to address those things. Okay.
Right.
So that's what I'd say there. Now.
Okay. Great.
I would start with the Communist Manifesto if you've never read any Marx. It's very interesting. It's not an easy text to read.
Even though it's a pamphlet.
Even though it's a pamphlet.
Yeah, it's still difficult.
Everything in Marx is difficult.
Yeah.
But it's a good kind of difficulty. I remember the first feeling I had when I read Marx. I'm like, oh boy, this is dizzying. This is dizzying. This is hard.
Yeah, certainly. It still is for me.
Yeah. So, but if you can work through that patiently, start with the Communist Manifesto, which is meant to be, this broadly accessible pamphlet. And what you'll get a sense of is this total breadth and depth that Marx brings out. I think then instead of going straight into Capital, I would recommend a few shorter lectures on the theory of political economy that Marx develops, such as Wage, Labor, and Capital, or Value, Price, and Profit. Then you can look at Capital, but read Capital. It's a 3-volume work. You should read that with a group. Try to read that with a group if you can. Okay. And that's a good way to meet other socialists and so on. And there's many capital reading groups. Once you've done that, or even before you've done that, you can also read a very cool text by Marx called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is his most literary and interesting work, in my opinion, because it's about this theory of the cycles of history and how they repeat. First as tragedy, then as farce.
Yeah, right.
So it's a very Hegelian idea of the cycles of history. And it gives you a theory to help you understand like things like Trump, right? But it also helps you understand like bourgeois politics. And you start to realize that bourgeois politics in structure has kind of remained constant since like the time of Marx to now, or very similar, let's say. That's very interesting. There's so much secondary literature. I mean, there's this incredible 2-volume work by Leszek Kołakowski called Main Currents of Marxism, which is very useful. You know why? It's like an encyclopedia. So you can basically read about Leninism, Maoism, Dungism. Every major Marxist philosopher has an excerpt. And the first part of the book is a prehistory of what Marxism signifies as a social movement prior to Marx. And there he starts with like Neoplatonism.
Wow.
All the way up. And he's like a very interesting figure. So that would be one. Once you get more advanced, you can do a lot of stuff. You can read Lukács, you can read Moise Postone, you can read David Harvey. When you read Capital,
I had David Harvey written down too. Yeah.
You could do David Harvey. On YouTube, the introductions to Capital is always useful. Michael Heinrich has a new biography of Marx that's worth looking at. I think that Marx is one of the greats of all time. it's mandatory reading. It's incredible stuff. It's life changing, I must say.
Yeah.
You know, it's worth your time. I think those are my main ones. I think
Okay.
if you've liked what we've said about alienation, you can check out the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. That's where he develops the theory of alienation really, really deeply. I think those are the main things, though.
All right. Well, Daniel, I really appreciate you coming on the channel. It was a phenomenal discussion, and a lot of respect for you and your work. And I hope we can do it again soon.
Eric, it's my pleasure and honor. Thank you for everything. Thank you for these challenging questions. I think we just hit 2-hour mark exactly.
Yeah.
So I hope friends and comrades have enjoyed our discussion.
All right, man. Take care.